What if the Emperor of mankind came into the Lord of the Rings? The Emperor stood motionless upon the summit of Mount Doom for 3 days and 3 nights. He did not eat, did not sleep. These were needs of mortal flesh, and he had transcended such limitations 30,000 years ago, in a different reality where time itself moved according to different rules. He simply observed. His vast psychic consciousness expanded outward, mapping this new universe with the same methodical precision he had once used to chart the stars of the Milky Way. What he found both fascinated and troubled him. This world operated on principles that should not exist. Matter here obeyed laws written not by physics, but by song, by music, by the will of a creator who had stepped back and allowed his creation to choose its own path. In the Emperor's universe, the warp existed as a reflection of consciousness, a roiling sea of emotion and thought that could be shaped by sufficient will. Here, there was no warp. Instead, there was the timeless void, and within it, the music of the Ainur, a grand symphony composed before the world itself took form. The Emperor listened to that music with senses that could perceive dimensions beyond mortal comprehension. He heard Melkor's discord, the original sin that had corrupted the song. He heard Ilúvatar's response, weaving even that discord into a greater harmony. And he understood something that shook even his ancient foundations. This was a universe where even rebellion had been anticipated, absorbed, and transformed into part of the design. The implications were staggering. In the Emperor's reality, chaos was the enemy. 4 dark gods who fed on suffering and perpetuated eternal war. But here, darkness had been allowed to exist as a necessary counterpoint to light. Free will was not an illusion maintained by the powerful, but a fundamental law of creatio. And every being, from the mightiest valor to the smallest insect, possessed genuine agency. They could choose. The Emperor, who had spent 10,000 years watching humanity squander that same gift, who had been forced to become a tyrant to save his species from extinction, now stood in a world where tyranny would be antithetical to the very fabric of existence. Could his methods work here? Or would Middle-earth reject him as a cancer, a foreign concept that had no place in Ilúvatar's design? Below him, armies began to gather. Mordor's forces, driven by Sauron's desperate will, assembled in greater numbers than had been seen since the last alliance. Orcs, trolls, and darker things poured from the Black Gate. They came with crude weapons and cruder faith, believing their master's lie that this golden intruder could be overwhelmed by sheer numbers. The Emperor watched them come. He calculated their movements, their morale, their breaking points. In another time, he would have unleashed his Astartes, and within hours, nothing would remain but ash and memory. But he held his hand, not from mercy. The Emperor had sacrificed mercy long ago on the altar of necessity, but from curiosity. He wanted to see how Sauron would adapt to an enemy he could not corrupt, could not dominate, could not understand. The answer came swiftly. Sauron did not attack. Instead, he sent an emissary, a man, or what had once been a man. The figure approached the summit through paths that should have burned any mortal to cinders, yet he walked unharmed. His robes were black, his face hidden beneath a hood that seemed to swallow light rather than cast shadow. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of the One Ring's corruption, dripping with false promises and honeyed lies. He offered alliance, power, dominion over all Middle-earth, shared between Sauron and this new god. Together they could remake the world. No more free will, no more chaos, only perfect, eternal order beneath 2 supreme rulers who understood that morality was a luxury the weak afforded themselves. The Emperor's response was not words, it was a single psychic pulse. The emissary's hood fell back, revealing a face twisted by centuries of service to darkness. And in that instant, the man saw every sin he had ever committed, every choice that had led him to this moment, laid bare before a consciousness that had witnessed the birth and death of countless civilizations. He saw his own soul reflected in the Emperor's golden gaze, and he understood how small he truly was, how small Sauron was. The emissary fled screaming, his mind fractured by the weight of that revelation. And Sauron, watching through his servant's eyes, felt something he had not experienced since before he forged the ring. He felt inadequate. Gandalf turned to his old friend. They did not need words, both understood. One of them had to go, had to meet this emperor face to face, and somehow, impossibly, find a way to make him understand that this world could not be saved by conquest, only by hope. The eye of Sauron blinked. For the first time in 3,000 years, the lidless eye faltered. The great orb of flame, which had watched every shadow from Mordor to the Grey Havens, suddenly saw something it could not comprehend. Something stared back, not with hatred, not with fear, but with the cold, calculated precision of a being who had watched galaxies burn and empires crumble into dust. The Dark Lord's fortress trembled. The mountains themselves seemed to bend away from what was coming, and in that moment every creature in Middle-earth, from the smallest hobbit to the mightiest Maya, felt a pressure building in their skulls, like the air before a thunderstorm that would never break. The tear in reality appeared above Mount Doom. Not a doorway, not a portal, a wound. The very fabric of Arda screamed as something impossible forced its way through the music of the Ainur itself. Golden light poured forth, but it was not the warm gold of the sun or the gentle radiance of the Eldar. This light burned, it commanded, it judged. The ash clouds of Mordor parted like subjects bowing before a king, revealing a figure that stood taller than any tower built by mortal hands. The Emperor of Mankind had entered a dream that was not his own, and he had come with 10,000 years of war etched into his very bones. If you want to witness what happens when two mythologies collide, when the grim darkness of the far future meets the ancient songs of creation, then subscribe, because this journey will take you through questions no one dared to ask. What happens when a god who demands obedience meets a world built on free will? Stay with me. Like this video if you're ready to see Middle-earth transformed forever. And comment below, tell me which world you think would break first. The Emperor descended. Each step upon the blackened rock of Mordor sent ripples through the warp, except there was no warp here. There was only the music, the great song that Eru Ilúvatar had sung into being at the dawn of time. Yet somehow the Emperor's psychic presence was rewriting the melody. His golden armor, crafted in an age when science and sorcery were one, reflected no light. Instead, it generated light as though he were a star given form and purpose. Behind him, the tier remained open, and through it, shadows moved. Massive shadows, the silhouettes of Astartes, his angels of death, waiting for the command to follow their father into this strange new realm. The Nazgûl were the first to respond. The 9 ringwraiths, servants of Sauron bound to eternal torment, rose from their fortresses and flew toward this intruder. Their fell beasts shrieked, sounds that had driven entire armies to madness. But as they approached the golden figure, their cries died in their throats. The Emperor turned his gaze upon them. No words, no gestures, just that gaze. And in that instant, the Nazgûl saw something that broke what little remained of their corrupted souls. They saw a being who had fought gods older than Melkor himself, a being who had stood alone against the Chaos gods and held them at bay for 10 millennia through sheer, unbreakable will. The ringwraiths scattered like leaves before a hurricane. Sauron felt it then. True fear, not the fear of defeat, he had known that before, but the fear of irrelevance. This new presence did not rage against him, did not plot conquest, it simply existed, and in existing, it made Sauron feel small. The Dark Lord, who had been the greatest servant of Morgoth, who had forged the One Ring to dominate all thinking beings, suddenly understood what it meant to be outmatched not by strength, but by sheer metaphysical weight. This golden being carried the faith of quintillions. Their prayers, their screams, their dying gasps all fed into his radiance. Sauron had perhaps a few million corrupted souls. The Emperor had consumed entire galaxies worth of worship. Across Middle-earth, reactions rippled outward like stones thrown into still water. In Lothlorien, Galadriel gasped, her mirror showing visions that made no sense. Cities of metal stretching beyond the horizon, weapons that could crack planets, wars that lasted for centuries without pause. She saw the future, but it was not Middle-earth's future. It was something else, something that had torn through the boundaries of this world. In Rivendell, Elrond led an emergency council. The wise elf lord had lived through ages of darkness, but even he had never felt presence like this. It was holy, it was terrible. It was the feeling of standing before a son that had been given consciousness and will. In the Shire, hobbits stopped mid-meal. They could not explain why, but every one of them felt compelled to look toward the east, toward Mordor, toward the light that burned there, brighter than any sunrise. Even the simple folk, who knew nothing of Maya or Valar, understood instinctively that something fundamental had changed. The world they knew, with its simple distinctions between good and evil, light and dark, had become infinitely more complicated. A third force had entered the game, and this force did not play by the rules established by Eru Ilúvatar at the dawn of time. But perhaps most disturbing of all was the reaction of the common men. In Gondor, in Rohan, in every human settlement from the Bay of Belfalas to the lands of the Easterlings, people felt it. Recognition. As though some deep genetic memory had awakened, the Emperor had been created from shamans of ancient terror, from the collective psychic might of humanity's protectors. And even here, across impossible distances and impossible realities, the humans of Middle-earth felt the call. They did not know his name yet, did not understand his purpose, but they knew, with certainty that transcended reason, that their god had finally arrived. And in that knowing, the first seeds of a new imperium began to take root in soil that had never known such absolute faith. The journey took 7 days. Gandalf traveled alone, his staff clicking against stone as he made his way through lands that had begun to change. The grass seemed to grow straighter, as if standing at attention. The wind blew in patterns that felt deliberate rather than random. Even the birds flew in formations that suggested order imposed from above rather than natural instinct. The Emperor's presence was already reshaping Middle-earth, not through conquest, but through sheer existential weight. Reality itself was bending to accommodate a consciousness that had spent millennia imposing its will upon the universe. Gandalf felt it in his bones, this Maya flesh that had housed his spirit for so long. Every step closer to Mordor was a step closer to a gravity well that threatened to pull everything into its orbit. He reached the borders of the Black Land on the 8th day. The orc patrols had vanished. The usual stench of corruption that hung over these lands had been replaced by something stranger, a sterile antiseptic quality to the air, as if the very concept of decay was being systematically eliminated. Gandalf paused at the edge of a crater that had not existed a week ago. At its center stood a structure that made his eyes water to look upon. It was not built from stone or wood, but from something else, pure thought made manifest, crystallized will, a fortress cathedral that existed simultaneously in the physical world and in realms of consciousness that Middle-earth had never known. The Emperor was not simply occupying Mordor, he was rewriting it at a fundamental level. As Gandalf approached, he became aware of watchers, not orcs, not men, something far more terrifying. Through the ash and smoke, he glimpsed them, figures in armor that dwarfed even the greatest warriors of Gondor. The Astartes, the Emperor's angels of death. They stood motionless at intervals around Tupo, a perimeter, each one a killing machine that combined the worst aspects of troll and elf, brutal strength wed to perfect discipline. Their armor bore symbols that hurt to comprehend, geometric patterns that suggested mathematics beyond mortal understanding. One of them turned its helmeted head toward Gandalf. The wizard felt that gaze like a physical weight. This was not malice, this was assessment. The Space Marine was calculating exactly how long it would take to kill him. The answer, Gandalf realized, was less than a second. But the Astartes did not move. Somewhere the Emperor had given an order, or perhaps had simply thought it, and these extensions of his will had understood. Gandalf was permitted to pass. He walked through the gateway of that impossible fortress, and with each step, the temperature dropped. Not from cold, but from the absence of heat, as if he were entering a space where even the concept of warmth was being questioned. The interior defied description. Corridors stretched into infinity. Walls reflected images of battles that had never been fought in this world, massive ships trading fire across the void between stars, creatures of pure nightmare clawing their way through rips in reality, worlds burning as populations chose extinction over surrender. This was the Emperor's memory, his history, and it was terrifying. At the center of it all, he waited. The Emperor sat upon a throne that had grown from the very rock of Mount Doom, transforming Sauron's forge into something far grander and far more terrible. He was beautiful in the way that a sun is beautiful, impossible to look upon directly, yet commanding absolute attention. His armor was silent, but Gandalf could hear it nonetheless, a psychic hum that resonated with the music of the Ainur in ways that created dissonance rather than harmony. When the Emperor finally spoke, his voice was not sound but pure meaning, bypassing Gandalf's ears and implanting itself directly into his consciousness. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of 30 millennia. "You have come to ask me to leave." Gandalf steadied himself with his staff. Speaking felt like pushing against a hurricane, but he forced the words out. "I have come to understand what you are, and to ask what you want." The Emperor's expression did not change, but the psychic pressure in the room intensified. "I want what I have always wanted: unity, an end to suffering, protection for humanity against forces that would consume it. I have watched species burn because they valued freedom over survival. I will not allow it again." His gaze fixed on Gandalf with an intensity that threatened to strip away the wizard's false form and reveal the Maya beneath. "You are not human. You are a servant of powers beyond this world, yet you presume to counsel humans on how to live. How is that different from what I do?" The question struck like a blade. Gandalf had spent thousands of years in Middle-earth, guiding, protecting, never commanding, or so he had told himself. But was that true? Had he not pushed Thorin toward Erebor, knowing it would lead to war? Had he not manipulated Bilbo into taking the ring, setting in motion events that would determine the fate of millions? The MP Era saw his hesitation and pressed the advantage. "You serve the one who sang this world into being. I am the one who holds back the gods who would devour it. We are both slaves to necessity, wizard. The only difference is that I am honest about it." The psychic weight increased, and Gandalf felt his knees buckling. "I did not ask to become what I am, just as you did not ask to be diminished and sent to this mortal form. But we both understood the burden. We both accepted it." Gandalf steadied himself, drawing on reserves of strength he had not needed to tap in centuries. "There is a difference. I guide, you command. I suggest, you compel. This world was built on the principle that even the smallest creature can choose to resist evil. Your presence here threatens to remove that choice entirely." The Emperor leaned forward, and for a moment Gandalf saw something in those ancient eyes. Not anger, something worse: pity. "Choice is a luxury afforded to species who do not face extinction. I gave humanity that luxury once. They chose to fall to darkness. They chose to worship chaos. They chose their own damnation. I will not make that mistake again. Not here. Not anywhere." The air between them crackled with opposing forces. The music of the Ainur, gentle and allowing, met the psychic dominion of a being who had been shaped by endless war. They could not coexist. One would have to bend, one would have to break. Gandalf raised his staff, knowing it was futile, knowing that he was a mayfly challenging the sun itself. But he raised it nonetheless, because that was what hope looked like in the face of overwhelming power. It was defiance, without expectation of victory. And the Emperor, seeing that defiance, understood something he had forgotten in his 10,000 years of godhood. He understood why this universe frightened him more than chaos ever had, because here, in this Isis and Distao, Impel Wizard's refusal to bow was proof that even the weakest being could contain infinite strength if they simply chose to resist. While Gandalf stood defiant before the Emperor, the world outside that fortress began to tear itself apart. Not through war, not yet, but through something far more insidious: belief. In Minas Tirith, the great white city of Gondor, Denethor the Steward received reports that made his blood run cold. Entire villages had emptied overnight. The peasants and farmers, those who had lived their lives in quiet service to the realm, had simply walked away. They moved east, toward Mordor, toward the golden light that promised an end to all suffering. His soldiers tried to stop them, but when you looked into the eyes of these pilgrims, you saw something that no sword could cut. You saw certainty. They were not being compelled, they were choosing, and that made it so much worse. The phenomenon spread like wildfire across all human lands. In Rohan, Theoden King watched as his own Eored, riders who had sworn blood oaths to his house, tore the green and gold from their cloaks and replaced them with symbols drawn in their own blood. A sunburst, a lightning bolt, an aquila, images that should have meant nothing to people of Middle-earth, yet somehow resonated in their souls like half-remembered dreams. The riders spoke of visions, of a future where humanity no longer cowered before elves or wizards or dark lords, where humans stood supreme, united under a single banner, a single purpose, a single god who understood their suffering because he had been one of them once. Theoden tried to reason with them. He failed. Reason could not compete with revelation. The elves reacted with horror. In Lothlorien, Galadriel called an emergency council of her people. The Lady of Light had gazed into her mirror and seen futures that made her ancient heart quail. She saw elves bending knee to the golden throne, saw their immortal grace sacrificed on the altar of human efficiency, saw the forests of Middle-earth cut down not by orcs, but by the faithful, who needed resources for forges that would burn day and night, producing weapons for wars that had not yet begun. Worst of all, she saw some elves accepting it. Younger elves, those who had grown weary of the slow fade, the gradual diminishing of their kind. They looked at the Emperor and saw what the elves could never be: eternal, unchanging, victorious. They saw a solution to the problem of mortality that did not require sailing into the west. Celeborn stood beside his wife, his face carved from stone. He had fought in wars spanning ages, had seen the fall of kingdoms and the rise of darkness in countless forms. But this was different. This was not corruption that could be cut away like diseased flesh. This was transformation at a fundamental level. The Emperor was not conquering Middle-earth, he was converting it, turning it into an extension of his own universe, where psychic dominion replaced the music, where faith became fuel, where the individual dissolved into the collective. And the terrible truth was that some saw it as salvation, some welcomed it. Because for all the beauty of Tolkien's world, it was a world where evil always returned, where peace was always temporary, where good people died for causes that never truly ended. The Emperor offered something Middle-earth had never known: finality. The dwarves proved most resistant to the Emperor's influence. In Erebor, beneath the lonely mountain, Dain Ironfoot called a moot of all dwarf lords. These were a people who had endured dragonfire, Balrog shadow, and countless wars without ever bowing to powers beyond their halls. Their minds were sharp, their wills ironclad, their loyalty to their own kind absolute. When scouts reported what was happening to the humans, when they heard tales of this new god demanding worship, the dwarves laughed. They had laughed at Sauron, they had laughed at Morgoth, they would laugh at this golden tyrant too. But the laughter died when the first dwarf converts arrived at their gates, bearing weapons that should not exist, hammers that hummed with psychic resonance, axes that could cut through stone as if it were cloth. The Emperor was not just taking followers, he was arming them. The dwarfsmiths examined these weapons with growing dread. The craftsmanship was beyond anything they had ever seen, beyond even the works of the ancient masters who had forged weapons for the wars of the First Age. These were not made by hand, they were shaped by will, by the same psychic force that powered the Emperor himself. And worse, they whispered. When you held them, you heard voices promising power, promising victory, promising a place in an empire that would span not just Middle-earth but all worlds. The dwarves had always prided themselves on their resistance to corruption. The rings of power had not enslaved them as they had enslaved men. But this was not corruption, this was seduction through competence. The Emperor did not offer empty promises, he offered results. And for a people who valued skill above all else, that was dangerously appealing. In the south and east, among the peoples who had always been marked as enemies by Gondor and its allies, the Emperor's arrival was greeted differently. Nantli, the Haradrim, the Easterlings, the Corsairs of Umbar, these were people who had been fighting against the so-called forces of good for generations. They had been cast as villains in a story written by elves and Western men. When emissaries bearing the Emperor's symbol arrived in their lands, they did not speak of domination. They spoke of equity. Under the Emperor, all humans were equal. Skin color meant nothing. Past allegiances meant nothing. Only faith and service mattered. For the first time, these marginalized peoples saw a path to respect that did not require them to give up their identities. They could remain who they were, fight as they had always fought, but this time for a power that saw them as valuable rather than expendable. The Haradrim chieftains met in their great tent cities beneath foreign stars. They debated through the night, weighing the offer against centuries of independence. Their priestesses consulted their gods, but found silence where once there had been answers. Something had changed in the spiritual realm. The old powers were retreating, not in fear, but in recognition that a new age had dawned. By morning, the decision was made. The Haradrim would not kneel to Gondor. They would not submit to elves who looked down upon them, but they would stand with this emperor, if only to see the look on Western faces when the marginalized became the mighty. And in that moment, the emperor gained not just followers, but an army that knew how to fight, how to hate, and most importantly, how to win. The first cathedral rose in what had once been the plains of Gorgoroth. It took 3 days to construct, not through manual labor, but through collective faith made manifest. 10,000 human converts stood in concentric circles, hands joined, voices raised in hymns that had never been sung in Middle-earth before. They sang of unity, of the Emperor's sacrifice, of humanity's destined supremacy among all the races of creation. And as they sang, the very ground responded. Stone lifted itself into pillars. Metal flowed up from the earth to form buttresses. Glass crystallized from sand to create windows that depicted battles from a universe these people had never known. The cathedral was not built, it was willed into existence, and when it was complete, it stood taller than any structure in Minas Tirith, a monument to what faith could accomplish when directed by absolute conviction. Inside, the first sermons began, not delivered by priests in the traditional sense, but by those who had been touched most deeply by the Emperor's psychic presence. They were called the Illuminated, men and women whose eyes had taken on a faint golden glow, whose words carried weight beyond mere rhetoric. They spoke of the old order with contempt. The elves, they said, were beautiful but barren. They created nothing new, only preserved what had been. They would fade, regardless of what anyone did. The dwarves hoarded wealth and craft, keeping secrets that could elevate all of humanity, selfish in their isolation. And the wizards? The wizards were servants of distant powers who cared nothing for the daily suffering of common people. But the Emperor, he understood. He had walked among humans, had bled as they bled, had risen to godhood not through birthright but through will. He was proof that humanity needed no one's permission to claim greatness. The converts listened with rapture. These were not grand lords or learned scholars. These were farmers whose fields had burned, soldiers whose commanders had sent them to die for causes they did not understand, mothers who had watched their children starve while elven kingdoms feasted in splendor, people who had been told their entire lives that they were lesser, that they should be grateful for whatever scraps the great powers deigned to offer. The Emperor's message cut through that lie like a blade through silk. You are not lesser. You have never been lesser. You have been kept down by those who fear what you might become if you stood united. And now, finally, you have a leader worthy of your devotion. The psychological impact was devastating. Within weeks, human settlements across Middle-earth had split, those who clung to the old ways and those who had been reborn in golden light. Aragorn saw it firsthand. The ranger had returned to the Angle, that wild land between the Bruinen and the Mythaethel, where his people had long dwelt in secret. He expected to find them as he had left them, hardy, independent, loyal to the memory of lost Númenor. Instead, he found division. Half the settlement had converted. They had torn down the silver star of the Dunedain and raised new banners, crude but powerful, depicting a blazing sun over a field of skulls. When Aragorn tried to speak with them, they looked at him with pity. One who had been his childhood friend stepped forward. The man's eyes held that golden glow. He spoke gently, as one might address a confused child. "You cling to a kingdom that will never return," he said. "You serve the memory of men who failed. The Emperor offers us a kingdom that will never fall. Join us, Aragorn. Become what you were meant to be, not the heir to ruins, but a general in an eternal empire." Aragorn refused. The decision cost him more than he could express. He watched friends, kinsmen, people he had protected for decades walk away from everything they had been. They did so with joy. That was the worst part. They were not coerced, not broken, they were fulfilled. In a way they had never been under his leadership. As he traveled south toward Rivendell to report what he had seen, Aragorn wrestled with questions that kept him awake at night. Had he been selfish, keeping his people tied to a hopeless dream? Was the Emperor's offer truly so terrible if it gave people purpose and peace? He knew what Gandalf would say, that freedom mattered more than happiness, that a comfortable slavery was still slavery. But Aragorn had seen enough suffering to wonder if perhaps that was a philosophy only those who had never starved could afford to hold. In the Shire, the hobbits remained largely unaffected. Geography protected them more than wisdom. The Emperor's influence spread through human populations like fire through dry grass, but the hobbits had little contact with the big folk. Still, word reached them eventually. Travelers spoke of wonders in the east, cities of gold, food that never ran out, protection from all threats in exchange for simple obedience. Some of the younger hobbits, those who had always felt the Shire was too small, too boring, began to ask uncomfortable questions. Why should they spend their lives farming the same fields their grandfathers had farmed? Why not see these wonders for themselves? Their elders shut down such talk immediately, but the seed had been planted. Even in the most innocent corner of Middle-earth, the Emperor's message was taking root. Legolas and Gimli traveled together through the Greenwood, the great forest that men called Mirkwood. The elf and dwarf had formed an unlikely friendship, bound by mutual respect and shared experiences in battles long past. Now they found that friendship tested as they debated what was happening to their world. Gimli, despite his people's general resistance, found himself grudgingly impressed by what the Emperor had accomplished. No bloodshed, no torture, just an offer of unity that millions had accepted. Was that not preferable to the endless cycles of war that had defined every age of Middle-earth? Legolas countered with passion unusual for his kind. Unity without choice is death, he argued. The Emperor does not see individuals, he sees resources. We would all become cogs in a machine, our uniqueness ground away until we were identical and useful. But Gimli had seen the weapons, had examined the craftsmanship, and he wondered, in moments he dared not voice aloud, what he might forge if he had access to such techniques. Their debate ended abruptly when they discovered the bodies. A small elvish settlement, no more than 20 souls, lay dead in their grove. But they had not been killed by violence. Each elf sat peacefully, hands folded, expressions serene. And on their foreheads, carved with precision that suggested ritual rather than brutality, was the symbol of the Aquila. Legolas fell to his knees, his normally composed face twisted with grief and confusion. These were his kin. They had chosen to die rather than exist in a world where the Emperor's influence was spreading. It was a statement, a rejection so absolute that death was preferable to witnessing what was coming. Gimli said nothing. There was nothing to say. They buried the elves in silence, and when they were done, both understood that neutrality was no longer possible. Everyone would have to choose, the Emperor or extinction, and increasingly those seemed like the only two options left. The Emperor had avoided the One Ring deliberately. For weeks he had felt its call, that insidious whisper promising dominion over all thinking beings in Middle-earth. It was crude compared to the psychic weapons he had wielded across millennia, laughable in its simplicity. Yet he recognized the craftsmanship. Sauron had created something that operated on principles similar to the warp, a focus for will, an amplifier of consciousness, a tool that bound souls through desire rather than force. The ring was dangerous not because it was powerful, but because it was seductive, and the Emperor, who had spent 10,000 years resisting far greater temptations, knew that underestimating such artifacts was how gods fell. So he had waited, studied, calculated, and now, finally, he was ready to confront it. The ring itself had become aware of the Emperor's presence. Artifacts of sufficient power developed something approaching consciousness, especially those forged with malicious intent. The ring had existed for thousands of years, had corrupted countless bearers, had orchestrated its own survival through manipulation and murder, but it had never encountered a will like this. The golden being radiating psychic force from Mordor was immune to its usual tactics. Promises of power meant nothing to one who already commanded galaxies. Appeals to ambition fell flat against a consciousness that had transcended such petty motivations. The ring realized, with something approaching panic, that it had met its superior. And so it did what any cornered predator does. It lashed out through the one connection it still maintained, its creator. Sauron felt the Emperor's attention turn toward the ring like the gaze of a searchlight piercing darkness. The Dark Lord had been preparing for this moment, marshalling every ounce of power he still possessed. His fortress of Barad-dûr pulsed with dark Aine. Argui, his armies stood ready, not to attack, but to die as fuel for one final working. Sauron knew he could not defeat this intruder through conventional means. The Emperor's power was simply too vast, too refined, too brutally efficient. But Sauron had learned one truth in his millennia of existence. Every being, no matter how powerful, had a weakness, and the Emperor's weakness was his conviction that he always knew better, that his way was the only way. Sauron would use that certainty as a blade, and the One Ring would be the handle. The Dark Lord poured himself into the ring, not just his power, but his very essence, his consciousness, everything that made him Sauron. The ring blazed with black fire, and across Middle-earth, every creature touched by its shadow felt that surge. The Nazgûl screamed, orcs fell to their knees. Even the stones of Barad-dûr groaned under the strain. Sauron was performing a working that no being in Middle-earth had attempted since Melkor himself had poured his power into Arda, diminishing himself to corrupt the world. The ring was no longer just an artifact. It became a weapon, a missile aimed directly at the Emperor's psychic presence. And in that moment, it struck, not at his body, not at his power, but at his purpose. It whispered a question that cut deeper than any blade. What if you are wrong? The Emperor staggered. For the first time since arriving in Middle-earth, his absolute certainty wavered. The question burrowed into his consciousness like a parasite, forcing him to confront memories he had buried beneath 30,000 years of necessity. He saw the Unification Wars, when he had convinced himself that humanity needed a tyrant to survive. He saw the Great Crusade, when he had told himself that genocide of alien species was justified by human survival. He saw the Horus Heresy, when his own sons turned against him because he had been too blind, too arrogant, too convinced of his own righteousness to see their pain. He saw 10,000 years on the Golden Throne, watching his empire become everything he had fought against. Superstitious, cruel, stagnant. And he saw this moment, in Middle-earth, preparing to impose the same pattern on a new world, the same mistakes, the same justifications, the same inevitable tragedy. But the Emperor was not human, had not been human for longer than civilizations endured. His moment of doubt lasted exactly 3 seconds before his will reasserted itself like steel gates slamming shut. The question had cut him, yes, had made him bleed in ways that physical weapons never could. But he had asked himself that question 1,000,000 times before, and the answer remained unchanged. He might be wrong, his methods might damn as many as they saved, but inaction was certainty of failure, and action was at least a chance at salvation. He would rather be a monster who tried than a saint who did nothing. The Emperor's psychic presence exploded outward, shattering Sauron's working like glass. The ring's consciousness retreated, wounded in ways artifacts should not be able to feel. And Sauron, having spent everything on that one gambit, felt his tower begin to crumble. Barad-dûr fell in silence. No explosions, no earthquakes, it simply stopped existing as a coherent structure, its stones losing the will that had held them together for millennia. Sauron's physical form dissolved, his power scattered across Middle-earth like ash on the wind. But he was not destroyed, could not be destroyed while the ring endured. He retreated into that golden band, his consciousness reduced to a whisper, waiting for the moment when the Emperor would claim it. Because Sauron understood something the Emperor did not. The ring was not just a tool, it was a test. And in Middle-earth, tests came from Ilúvatar himself. The question now was not whether the Emperor would take the ring. He would. The question was what would happen when a being of absolute will claimed an artifact designed to corrupt absolute will. Would the Emperor master it, or would something new be born, something that combined the worst aspects of both? Gandalf felt Sauron's fall from hundreds of miles away. The wizard stood on the borders of the Shire, having traveled there to ensure the hobbits remained protected from the spreading Imperial influence. When the psychic shockwave rolled across Middle-earth, he fell to his knees, his staff clattering from nerveless fingers. His Maya senses, usually so reliable, showed him fragmentary visions. The Emperor standing alone in the ruins of Barad-dûr, the One Ring lying at his feet, waiting. And behind the Emperor, something stirring in the void between worlds, something that had noticed this reality, had seen the tear through which the Emperor had entered, and was even now pushing against the barriers that kept it out. The Chaos Gods. They had found Middle-earth, and they were hungry for a world that had never known their touch, souls that had never been corrupted by the warp, faith that had never been twisted. Toward their dark purposes, the Emperor's arrival had been a beacon, and what came next would make Sauron look like a minor irritant by comparison. The Emperor stood in the ruins of Barad-dûr, his golden armor dusted with the ash of Sauron's fallen tower. At his feet lay the One Ring, a simple band of gold that radiated power in frequencies that made reality itself uncomfortable. He did not reach for it immediately. Instead, he studied it with the same methodical patience he had applied to every weapon, every artifact, every tool of power he had encountered across 30 millennia. The ring was sophisticated in ways that surprised him. It did not simply amplify the wearer's desires, it learned them, adapted to them, became exactly what they needed it to be in order to achieve total corruption. Against a normal being, even one of considerable strength, it was nearly irresistible. But the Emperor was not normal. He had been fighting corruption since before this world was sung into existence. He reached down. The moment his fingers touched the metal, the ring screamed, not with sound, but with pure conceptual horror. It had never been worn by a being like this. Every previous bearer had possessed desires it could exploit, weaknesses it could widen, dreams it could twist. But the Emperor's desires were so vast, so absolute, so uncompromising that the ring found no purchase. He wanted to save humanity, all of it, forever, at any cost. There was no room in that desire for personal ambition, for petty tyranny, for the small corruptions that the ring specialized in. The artifact tried to show him visions of himself as supreme ruler of all existence, but he already saw himself that way. It tried to promise him the power to protect everyone he loved, but he had sacrificed love 10,000 years ago. It tried everything, and nothing worked. Then the ring tried something it had never attempted before. It showed him the truth, not lies wrapped in pretty promises, but actual, unvarnished truth. It showed him what he would become if he conquered Middle-earth. The forced conversions, the purges of those who resisted, the slow grinding away of everything that made this world beautiful in pursuit of efficiency. The elves dying out not from fade but from extermination. The hobbits regimented into agricultural units, the dwarves enslaved in endless forges. The songs of Ilúvatar drowned beneath imperial hymns. It showed him becoming the very thing he had fought against for his entire existence, a tyrant who justified every atrocity through the mathematics of survival. And the ring whispered its final devastating question: is survival worth this price, or would it be kinder to let them keep their souls and lose their lives? The Emperor stood frozen. The ring had found his weakness after all, not pride, not ambition, but empathy. The last fragment of his humanity, buried so deep he had almost forgotten it existed. For 3 centuries he stood there, motionless as a statue, waging an internal war that would have shattered lesser minds in seconds. Every argument he had ever made to justify his actions rose up to be examined. Every sacrifice he had demanded, every world he had burned, every son he had lost. The weight of it all pressed down with force that would have crushed mountains. And in that crushing pressure, the Emperor made his choice. He would wear the ring, would master it, would use it to defend Middle-earth not from Sauron, but from what was coming. Because the Chaos Gods had found this world, and without his intervention, every soul here would suffer fates that made Sauron's tyranny look like mercy. The ring slid onto his finger. Reality bent. The music of the Ainur, that fundamental symphony underlying all of Middle-earth, suddenly had a new instrument, not harmonizing with the existing melodies, but playing in a different key, creating dissonance that was somehow still beautiful. The Emperor's consciousness expanded, touching every corner of Arda simultaneously. He felt every living being, from the greatest valor to the smallest insect. He could have dominated them all, bent every will to his purpose, created the unity he had always dreamed of achieving. But he did not, because wearing the ring and being corrupted by it were different things. He held it in check through sheer force of will, using its power while refusing to let it use him. It was agony. Every moment wearing it was like holding a star in his bare hands, feeling it burn, refusing to let go. But he had endured worse, would endure this too. The first sign of chaos came 3 days later. In a quiet village on the borders of Rohan, a child was born. The mother survived the birth, which should have been a blessing. But when they cleaned the infant and examined it properly, the midwives screamed. The child had too many eyes, its fingers bent in directions that violated fundamental geometry. When it cried, the sound made listeners taste colors that had no names. The village priest was called. He performed every blessing he knew, but they slid off the child like water off hot iron. By nightfall, the mother had begun changing too. Her skin took on a luminous quality, and when she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that suggested laughter from somewhere else. The village burned the house. It did not help. The taint spread. Within a week, half the village had developed mutations. Within 2 weeks, they had formed a cult, worshipping powers they had no names for, but felt in their bones. Gandalf arrived too late. 8. The village was already lost, its people transformed into something that made orcs look wholesome by comparison. These were not corrupted by darkness. They were corrupted by change itself, by possibility run riot, by the unlimited potential of flesh given will of its own. Tzeentch had found Middle-earth. The changer of ways, youngest and most cunning of the Chaos Gods, had sent his essence through the tear left by the Emperor's arrival. And in a world built on songs and free will, where change was not just possible but fundamental to the nature of creation, Tzeentch found fertile ground beyond his wildest hopes. Gandalf did the only thing he could. He called down fire, holy fire, the kind that burned away corruption at the cost of everything it touched. The village ceased to exist. Its people were granted mercy through annihilation, and Gandalf wept because he knew this was just the beginning. The Emperor felt it too, felt Tzeentch's presence spreading like ink through water, subtle and insidious. The Chaos God was not attacking, not yet, just testing, seeing what this new reality would allow, what its rules were, how far corruption could spread before something stopped it. And the Emperor understood with terrible clarity that he had made a catastrophic mistake. By entering Middle-earth, by tearing a hole between realities, he had not saved this world. He had doomed it. The Chaos Gods would come, all 4 of them eventually, and when they did, Middle-earth would have no defense. The Valar were powerful, but they fought according to rules, according to the music. Chaos had no rules. It was anti-music. It was the scream that shattered every song. The only force in all of existence that might hold them back was him. And to do that, he would have to transform Middle-earth into the same fascist nightmare he had created in his own universe. The choice was no longer between freedom and slavery. It was between slavery and annihilation. And that, finally, was when the Emperor understood why Ilúvatar had allowed him to enter this world, not as salvation, but as judgment. The call went out across Middle-earth in a voice that bypassed ears entirely. Every sentient being heard it simultaneously, not as sound, but as inescapable understanding planted directly into their consciousness. The Emperor spoke, and his words carried the weight of absolute authority. A threat has come that makes all previous conflicts meaningless. The Chaos Gods have found this world. They will corrupt everything you are, everything you love, everything you hold sacred. There is only one path to survival: unity. Total, absolute, uncompromising unity under my command. Those who refuse will not be punished. They will simply be the first to fall, and their corruption will spread to everyone they have ever known. Choose now. The psychic pressure accompanying this message was so intense that birds fell from the sky. Rivers momentarily flowed backward. The very stones groaned under the weight of his will. In Rivendell, the reaction was immediate chaos. Elves who had lived for thousands of years, who had never known fear in its purest form, now felt terror clawing at their minds. Elrond called an emergency council, but before anyone could speak, Galadriel appeared. She had traveled from Lothlorien at impossible speed, her power blazing around her like a storm. The Lady of Light was radiant with fury and desperation. She had looked into her mirror and seen the futures that awaited them. In every vision where they refused the Emperor, she saw worlds of flesh and madness, saw elves twisted into things that screamed in colors, saw the forests themselves gaining malicious consciousness. But in the futures where they accepted his rule, she saw something almost worse. She saw them surviving, but hollow, their songs mechanical, their immortality not transcendent but bureaucratic, living forever, but no longer alive. The debate that followed was the most heated in Rivendell. Elves' history. Some argued for resistance, for maintaining their principles even unto death. Others, particularly younger elves who had grown weary of the slow fade, argued for pragmatism. Survival mattered more than pride. What use was freedom if you were too dead or corrupted to exercise it? The discussion went in circles until Elrond finally stood and brought silence with a gesture. He spoke with the authority of one who had witnessed every age of Middle-earth, who had stood beside Gil-galad when the last alliance marched on Mordor. "We are faced with an impossible choice," he said, "but there is wisdom in accepting what we cannot change. The Emperor did not ask for our worship. He asked for our obedience in the face of annihilation. If we must bend, let us bend like reeds in a storm, knowing that we preserve our roots even as our tops bow low." The dwarves gathered in Erebor faced a simpler calculation. Dian Ironfoot had seen the chaos mutations spreading, had received reports of entire mining communities transformed overnight into writhing masses that had to be sealed in their tunnels and flooded with molten stone. The dwarves understood pragmatism in ways that elves never could. They had always survived through adaptation, through making deals when necessary, through knowing when to fight and when to entrench. Dain stood before his assembled lords and spoke without poetry or philosophy. The Golden Tyrant offers us protection in exchange for service. He offers us weapons beyond our comprehension in exchange for loyalty. He offers us survival in exchange for pride. I know what I choose. Any who disagree may speak now, and I will grant them the honor of manning the first defense when chaos comes for our halls. No one spoke. The decision was made. The dwarves would join the Emperor's Imperium. In Gondor, civil war erupted. The nobility, led by Denethor, refused to bow to the Emperor. They had spent generations defending Middle-earth against darkness, and they would not trade one tyrant for another, regardless of his justifications. But the common soldiers, the farmers, the craftsmen, they remembered the Emperor's message. They had seen what chaos could do. They had friends in the infected villages, family members who had been mercy-killed before they could spread their mutations. The lower classes rose up not in anger, but in desperation. They did not hate their lords. They simply wanted to live. The fighting lasted 3 days before Denethor was forced to retreat into Minas Tirith. The city sealed its gates, becoming an island of resistance in a sea of conversion. The Emperor did not assault the walls. He simply waited, let them watch as the world around them joined his banner, let them feel the isolation, let them understand that their principles were luxuries that would cost not just their own lives, but the lives of everyone they claimed to protect. Aragorn wandered the wilderness, torn between identities. He was Isildur's heir, born to rule Gondor, to restore the line of kings. But what meaning did that hold when kingdoms themselves had become obsolete? The Emperor offered not restoration, but transformation, a new order where bloodlines meant nothing, where only competence and loyalty mattered. Part of Aragorn hated it, the part that had spent decades preparing for a crown that might never come. But another part, the part that had walked among common people and seen their suffering, wondered if perhaps the age of kings had always been doomed to fail. If perhaps humanity needed not the best among them elevated, but all of them unified. He thought of Arwen, his beloved, waiting for him in Rivendell. Would she even recognize what he was becoming? Would he recognize himself? The hobbits of the Shire held a great meeting at Michel Delving. Every family sent representatives. The debate was surprisingly short. The mayor stood and spoke what everyone was thinking. We have been safe here because we are small, because we matter to no one. But this chaos the Emperor speaks of does not care about size or importance. It will find us eventually, will turn our children into things from nightmare. We have a choice, we can accept. The hobbits of the Shire held a great meeting at Michel Delving. Every family sent representatives. The debate was surprisingly short. The mayor stood and spoke what everyone was thinking. We have been safe here because we are small, because we matter to no one. But this chaos the Emperor speaks of does not care about size or importance. It will find us eventually, will turn our children into things from nightmare. We have a choice. We can accept the Emperor's protection and probably lose much of what makes us who we are. Or we can refuse, stay true to ourselves, and guarantee that we lose everything. The hobbits voted by show of hands. The result was overwhelming. They would accept the Emperor's rule, but on one condition, that they be allowed to keep their shire, their simple lives, their gardens and their festivals. That they serve not as warriors, but as providers, food for the Emperor's armies, beer for his soldiers, the small comforts that kept people human even in the darkest times. The Emperor, to everyone's surprise, agreed. He understood that an empire needed more than warriors. It needed souls worth fighting for. By the end of the month, 90% of Middle-earth had bent the knee. The great cathedral in Gorgoroth had been joined by dozens more, each one a fortress temple that served as both worship site and military installation. The Astartes had been joined by the first Middle-earth-born Space Marines, volunteers who underwent the transformation with full knowledge that they would never again be entirely themselves. The process killed 9 out of 10 candidates. Those who survived emerged as something between man and weapon, their bodies rebuilt to superhuman specifications, their minds hardwired with loyalty to the Emperor that went beyond faith into biological imperative. They were horrifying, they were necessary, and they were just the beginning. The Emperor had transformed Middle-earth in less than 3 months from a world of free peoples into an industrial war machine. But as he looked out from his throne at the armies assembling, at the forges burning day and night, at the populations organizing themselves into efficient hierarchies, he felt no triumph. Only the weight of another species sacrificed on the altar of survival, and the terrible knowledge that this time there would be no one left to judge whether the cost had been worth paying. The Chaos incursion began on the winter solstice. The timing was not coincidence, but deliberation. The Chaos gods understood symbolism, understood that corruption worked best when it violated sacred moments. Across Middle-earth, in every settlement from the Grey Havens to the Sea of Rune, rifts opened simultaneously. They were not tears like the one the Emperor had created. These were wounds that wept. From each rift poured entities that had no right to exist in a universe governed by the music of the Ainur. Demons, creatures of pure emotion given form and malice, bloodletters that howled with the rage of every murder ever committed, plague-bearers that giggled as they spread diseases that could corrupt souls as easily as flesh, daemonettes that promised pleasures so intense they would shatter minds, and everywhere, always, the horrors of Tzeentch, shifting, changing, never the same shape twice, living embodiments of possibility run amok. The first line of defense was not the Emperor's forces, it was the land itself. Middle-earth was not just a world, it was a song given substance, and that song had defensive mechanisms built into its very structure. The mountains rose higher, creating barriers against the demon tide. The rivers ran with water that burned the immaterial flesh of chaos entities. The forests themselves fought back, with trees moving to crush intruders, with roots that sought out corruption and strangled it. Galadriel stood in Lothlorien, her power blazing so brightly that mortals could not look upon her, and she sang. She sang the songs of the First Age, the melodies that had been taught to elves by the Valar themselves, and where her voice reached, the demons faltered, not destroyed, but held at bay. For the first time in 10,000 years, Chaos encountered a universe that rejected them at a fundamental level. But rejection was not enough. The demons adapted. That was their nature. For every barrier Middle-earth raised, Chaos found a crack. They could not corrupt the land directly, so they corrupted the people who lived upon it. A farmer who gave in to despair became a gateway. A soldier who felt rage at fallen comrades became a portal. A mother who mourned a dead child with such intensity that she would do anything at all, to see that child again became a conduit through which Nurgle's plagues could flow. The Chaos Gods were patient. They had eternity. They would win, not through overwhelming force, but through the simple fact that every thinking being in Middle-earth experienced emotions, and emotions were their food, their tools, their weapons. All they had to do was wait for people to feel, and in feeling, to crack. That was when the Emperor's true war began. He deployed the Astartes in formations that had been perfected across 10,000 years of endless conflict. They struck not at the demons themselves, that would come later, but at the corrupted population centers. Any settlement showing signs of chaos taint was quarantined. Any individual displaying mutations was executed. Any thought of mercy, any hesitation, any moment of weakness was crushed beneath the iron logic of necessity. The newly converted Space Marines of Middle-earth fought alongside their brothers from beyond the stars. They killed former neighbors, former friends, former family members. They did so without hesitation, because their conditioning left no room for doubt. And in their wake, they left silence. Not peace, never peace, just the absence of chaos, purchased with blood and ash. Gandalf watched this purge from the borders of the Shire, and something inside him broke. He had spent thousands of years in Middle-earth believing in the possibility of redemption, believing that even the most corrupted soul could be turned back toward light. The Emperor's methods left no room for such hope. A corrupted person was not a person to be saved. They were a vector to be eliminated. It was efficient. It was logical. It was absolutely necessary given the nature of chaos. And it was everything Gandalf had spent his existence fighting against. He stood in the rain, his grey robes soaked through, and for the first time in his long life, questioned whether his mission had any meaning. If survival required becoming the very thing you fought against, was survival worth it? Or was there a third option, one that neither the Emperor nor the Chaos Gods had considered? The answer came from an unexpected source. The Valar, who had been silent since the Emperor's arrival, finally acted, but they did not act openly. They could not. To manifest in Middle-earth with their full power would destroy the world they sought to protect. Instead, they worked through Gandalf, pouring into him a portion of their collective might. The wizard's grey robes burned away, replaced by robes of pure white that shone with light older than stars. His staff became a conduit for power that made even the Emperor's psychic dominion seem small by comparison. Because the Valar were not individuals imposing their will, they were the music itself given consciousness. They were Middle-earth's immune system, and they had finally recognized the infection, not just chaos, but the Emperor too. Both were foreign elements that needed to be excised if this world was to survive intact. Gandalf the White rose into the air above the Shire, and his voice rang out with such authority that every being in Middle-earth stopped what they were doing and listened. He spoke not in words, but in pure meaning, in concepts that transcended language. You have two tyrants fighting over your souls. One promises salvation through dominance. The other promises liberation through madness. I offer a third path, the path of sacrifice. Every person in Middle-earth heard him and understood. They could fight, could resist both chaos and the Emperor. But it would cost them everything, their lives, their world, perhaps even their souls. But they would die free, die as themselves, die knowing they had chosen their end rather than accepting someone else's vision of their future. It was not a call to victory, it was a call to glorious, defiant annihilation. The Emperor felt the shift immediately, felt his carefully constructed unity begin to fracture as people across Middle-earth started making the impossible choice. Some chose him, believing survival outweighed all other concerns. Some chose chaos, seduced by promises of power, or simply broken beyond caring. But a third group, the largest group, chose Gandalf's path. They armed themselves with whatever weapons they could find. They formed circles in their villages and towns. They locked hands and began to sing, not imperial hymns, not chaos chants, but the old songs, the songs of Ilúvatar, the songs that had shaped this world from void. and as they sang, they began to burn, not with corruption, not with holy fire, but with the simple, terrible power of choice exercised to its ultimate extreme. They were erasing themselves from existence rather than serve any master, and the Emperor, watching this unfold, finally understood the true horror of what he had brought to Middle-earth. Not salvation, not damnation, but the death of hope itself. The final confrontation took place where it had all begun, in the ruins of Mount Doom. The Emperor stood at the summit, the one ring burning on his finger with power that was tearing his physical form apart, molecule by molecule. Around him, three forces converged. The Chaos Gods, manifesting as much of themselves as Middle-earth's reality would allow, appeared as shadows that hurt to perceive. Gandalf the White ascended from the west, carrying the authority of the valor and the desperate hope of free peoples. And from the east came the remnants of Sauron, his consciousness having reformed within the ring itself, now locked in psychic battle with the Emperor for control of the artifact. Four powers, each representing a different answer to the universe's oldest question. How should beings of power treat those weaker than themselves? The answers would determine not just Middle-earth's fate, but whether this world would continue to exist at all. The Chaos Gods struck first, not with violence but with truth. They showed the Emperor exactly what his Imperium had become in his absence. 10,000 years of stagnation, trillions living in misery, technology failing, superstition rising. The very thing he had built to protect humanity was now its greatest oppressor, and they whispered the question he had avoided for millennia. Was it worth it? All the sacrifice, all the suffering, all the billions burned to keep the Imperium alive. Did it actually save anyone, or did it just prolong their agony? The psychic weight of that question staggered him, because deep down, beneath 30,000 years of justification and necessity, he knew the answer. He had failed. His methods had not saved humanity. They had merely transformed one kind of hell into another. Gandalf saw the Emperor falter and pressed his advantage. He did not attack. Instead, he offered mercy. "Leave," he said. "Take your Astartes, your converts, your terrible weapons, return to your universe and leave ours to face whatever comes. We would rather die on our own terms than live on yours." The Emperor's response was not anger but exhaustion. "You do not understand what you are refusing. Chaos will consume this world. Every soul will be twisted into something unrecognizable. There will be no noble death, no glorious sacrifice, only eternal torment." Gandalf's reply cut deeper than any blade. "Then that is what we choose, because a universe where only tyrants can save us is not a universe worth saving." The statement hung in the air like a funeral bell. Two philosophies, two visions of salvation, both utterly incompatible. Sauron, trapped within the ring, watched this debate with something approaching fascination. He had spent millennia trying to dominate Middle-earth through lies and fear. These two were attempting the same goal through opposite means, one through absolute order, one through absolute freedom. Both were fools. True power required neither dominance nor permission. It required understanding that suffering was not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be accepted. He reached out through the ring, not to control the Emperor, but to show him something, a vision of Middle-earth's future. If the Emperor left, chaos would come, the free peoples would die. But from that death, something new would grow, stronger, harder, forged by suffering rather than protected from it. Evolution through catastrophe. The Darwinian answer to salvation that both Gandalf and the Emperor had rejected. Choose weakness now and strength later, or choose strength now and weakness forever. The Emperor stood at the center of these three philosophies, and for the first time in his existence, he did not know what to do. Every choice led to damnation. If he stayed and imposed his will, he would destroy everything that made Middle-earth worth saving. If he left, he would doom billions to chaos. If he did nothing, the universe itself might tear apart under the weight of these conflicting powers. The ring burned hotter on his finger, feeding on his doubt, growing stronger with every moment of his hesitation. And in that burning, he finally understood what Ilúvatar had intended. This was not a test of power, it was a test of wisdom. The Emperor had spent 30 millennia believing that will and strength could solve any problem. But Middle-earth operated on different principles. Here the strongest thing was not power but surrender, not victory but acceptance, not life but the willingness to let go. He made his choice. The Emperor removed the ring. The moment it left his finger, reality screamed. The artifact, suddenly freed from his dominating will, exploded with power that had been building for weeks. The explosion was not physical, but existential. It reached backward and forward through time simultaneously, unwriting the Emperor's arrival from Middle-earth's history. The tear between realities sealed. The Chaos Gods, losing their anchor to this world, were pushed back into the void. The Astartes, the cathedrals, the weapons, the converts, all of it began to fade like a dream upon waking. People who had bent the knee suddenly stood straight, remembering their choices but free from their consequences. The Emperor himself began to dissolve, his psychic presence too large for this universe to contain without the ring as a focusing point. But before he vanished completely, he did one final thing. He poured every remaining fragment of his power into the land itself, into the mountains and rivers, into the forests and plains. He gave Middle-earth his strength, his will, his absolute refusal to surrender, not as dominance, but as a gift, a vaccination against chaos made from his own essence. The people of Middle-earth would never know his name, would never remember the months when a golden god had walked among them, but they would be protected. When chaos came again, and it would come again, the land would remember, would fight, would hold, and perhaps, in some distant future, they would be strong enough to face that darkness on their own terms. It was not the salvation he had intended, but it was the only salvation he could give that did not destroy what he was trying to save. Gandalf stood alone on Mount Doom as the last traces of the Emperor's presence faded into morning light. The wizard felt tears on his face but did not understand why he was crying. Something important had happened, something that had changed him fundamentally, but the memory of it was already slipping away, dissolving like mist under the sun. He remembered a choice, remembered standing against something vast and terrible and beautiful. Remembered that Middle-earth had been given a chance to die free rather than live enslaved, and had chosen to die, and in that choice had somehow survived. The music of the Ainur sang around him, and within that song he heard a new harmony, faint but present, a melody in a key that did not belong to this world, but which had been woven into the symphony nonetheless. The echo of a god who had learned finally that some things cannot be saved by strength alone. And far away in a universe of endless war, the Emperor opened his eyes upon the golden throne. He did not remember Middle-earth, could not remember. The journey had been erased from causality itself, but something had changed. Some weight he had carried for 10,000 years felt fractionally lighter, and in the deepest chambers of his consciousness, where even he could not consciously access, a single thought remained. There are worlds where hope still lives. Worlds where the weak choose their fate rather than accepting salvation from the strong. Worlds that reject salvation entirely if it comes wrapped in chains. Those worlds are doomed, but their doom is beautiful, and perhaps, that beauty is worth more than any amount of survival. He would never act on that thought, could never act on it. The Imperium needed him to be absolute, but the thought existed, and in existing it changed everything and nothing, which is how all the best stories end, not with answers, but with the recognition that some questions are more important than their solutions. The eye of Sauron blinked. For the first time in 3,000 years, the lidless eye faltered. The great orb of flame, which had watched every shadow from Mordor to the Grey Havens, suddenly saw something it could not comprehend. Something stared back. Not with hatred, not with fear, but with the cold, calculated precision of a being who had watched galaxies burn and empires crumble into dust. The Dark Lord's fortress trembled. The mountains themselves seemed to bend away from what was coming. And in that moment, every creature in Middle-earth, from the smallest hobbit to the mightiest Maya, felt a pressure building in their skulls, like the air before a thunderstorm that would never break. The tear in reality appeared above Mount Doom, not a doorway, not a portal, a wound. The very fabric of Arda screamed as something impossible forced its way through the music of the Ainur itself. Golden light poured forth, but it was not the warm gold of the sun or the gentle radiance of the Eldar. This light burned, it commanded, it judged. The ash clouds of Mordor parted like subjects bowing before a king, revealing a figure that stood taller than any tower built by mortal hands. The Emperor of mankind had entered a dream that was not his own, and he had come with 10,000 years of war etched into his very bones. If you want to witness what happens when two mythologies collide, when the grim darkness of the far future meets the ancient songs of creation, then subscribe, because this journey will take you through questions no one dared to ask. What happens when a god who demands obedience meets a world built on free will? Stay with me, like this video if you're ready to see Middle-earth transformed forever, and comment below. Tell me which world you think would break first. The Emperor descended. Each step upon the blackened rock of Mordor sent ripples through the warp, except there was no warp here. There was only the music, the great song that Eru Ilúvatar had sung into being at the dawn of time. Yet somehow the Emperor's psychic presence was rewriting the melody. His golden armor, crafted in an age when science and sorcery were one, reflected no light. Instead, it generated light, as though he were a star given form and purpose. Behind him, the tier remained open, and through it, shadows moved. Massive shadows, the silhouettes of Astartes, his angels of death, waiting for the command to follow their father into this strange new realm. The Nazgûl were the first to respond. The 9 ringwraiths, servants of Sauron bound to eternal torment, rose from their fortresses and flew toward this intruder. Their fell beasts shrieked, sounds that had driven entire armies to madness. But as they approached the golden figure, their cries died in their throats. The Emperor turned his gaze upon them. No words, no gestures, just that gaze. And in that instant, the Nazgûl saw something that broke what little remained of their corrupted souls. They saw a being who had fought gods older than Melkor himself, a being who had stood alone against the Chaos gods and held them at bay for 10 millennia through sheer, unbreakable will. The ringwraiths scattered like leaves before a hurricane. Sauron felt it then, true fear. Not the fear of defeat, he had known that before, but the fear of irrelevance. This new presence did not rage against him, did not plot conquest. It simply existed, and in existing, it made Sauron feel small. The Dark Lord, who had been the greatest servant of Morgoth, who had forged the One Ring to dominate all thinking beings, suddenly understood what it meant to be outmatched not by strength, but by sheer metaphysical weight. This golden being carried the faith of quintillions. Their prayers, their screams, their dying gasps, all fed into his radiance. Sauron had perhaps a few million corrupted souls. The Emperor had consumed entire galaxies worth of worship. Across Middle-earth, reactions rippled outward like stones thrown into still water. In Lothlorien, Galadriel gasped, her mirror showing visions that made no sense. Cities of metal stretching beyond the horizon, weapons that could crack planets, wars that lasted for centuries without pause. She saw the future, but it was not Middle-earth's future. It was something else, something that had torn through the boundaries of this world. In Rivendell, Elrond called an emergency council. The wise elf lord had lived through ages of darkness, but even he had never felt presence like this. It was holy. It was terrible. It was the feeling of standing before a son that had been given consciousness and will. In the Shire, hobbits stopped mid-meal. They could not explain why, but every one of them felt compelled to look toward the east, toward Mordor, toward the light that burned there brighter than any sunrise. Even the simple folk who knew nothing of Maya or Valar understood instinctively that something fundamental had changed. The world they knew, with its simple distinctions between good and evil, light and dark, had become infinitely more complicated. A third force had entered the game, and this did not play by the rules established by Eru Ilúvatar at the dawn of time. But perhaps most disturbing of all was the reaction of the common men. In Gondor, in Rohan, in every human settlement from the Bay of Belfalas to the lands of the Easterlings, people felt it. Recognition, as though some deep genetic memory had awakened. The Emperor had been created from shamans of ancient terror, from the collective psychic might of humanity's protectors. And even here, Across impossible distances and impossible realities, the humans of Middle-earth felt the call. They did not know his name yet, did not understand his purpose, but they knew with certainty that transcended reason that their God had finally arrived, and in that knowing, the first seeds of a new imperium began to take root in soil that had never known such absolute faith.